So I haven't said this in a video yet, and so to both fill in any subscribers and also explain my absence from uploading recently, in November I matriculated as a student at Oxford University, so I've been busy studying philosophy and religion. If you hear any noise in the background, by the way, or think that I'm talking more quietly than usual, it's because I'm in university accommodation. Studying at Oxford affords innumerable privileges, and not least among these is the eligibility to become a member of the Oxford Union, one of England's oldest and most respected debating societies. It hosts individual talks and also debates from and between an incredibly wide range of influential people. Past guests have included Malcolm X, Bernie Sanders, Mark Hamill, Jeremy Corbyn, Tommy Robinson and ASAP Rocky. Now, it's not uncommon for a speaker to be invited who isn't most welcomed by the students of Oxford. Of course, this is in large part why the union exists in the first place. And last week it hosted Steve Bannon, former executive chairman of Breitbart News and former chief strategist of Donald Trump, of course. And no prizes for guessing how students in a fairly liberal city like Oxford reacted to this invitation. Immediately after this event was announced, there was quickly organised a protest to take place outside of the Oxford Union. Now, for myself, in situations where speakers I abhor are putting themselves in front of an audience, my favourite place to be, always, is in the room. It troubles me not at all that many people prefer to take part in a protest like the one being organised instead and voice opposition from the outside, usually gaining more public attention by doing so anyway. Fair enough. I do love a good protest. I was quite excited to go and see Bannon and to see the protesters and, of course, to see the fiery debates that would inevitably ensue, but when I got there, I quickly realised that that wasn't happening. Protesters of Bannon had shown up in their hundreds and set up a blockade, physically preventing anybody from entering and, I presume, also leaving the union. I'm aware that this kind of protest happens all the time, especially in the US, for speakers like Ben Shapiro at Berkeley and the like. But I'd never experienced one in person before, and after realising that I wasn't getting in, I decided to pull out my phone and start live streaming, basically interviewing anybody that I could, which you can now see on my channel, of course. But it really gave me some time to think about it and to talk to many people of varied opinions about protesting and free speech, and I've spent a lot of time considering whether it's acceptable to do what these protesters were doing. Overall, my takeaway, and the position that I want to share with you here, is this. The protesters blocking entrances to the union and physically preventing movement in a public space should be ashamed of themselves. I want to explain why I think this form of protest is not acceptable, and also that criticising this is not criticising the right to protest altogether. There's an increasingly common debate surrounding the right to shut down controversial speakers, as the common terminology goes, and it's something that we should be very, very careful about. It's not something that I've really spoken on before, so consider this my contribution. Now, there's no doubt in my mind, of course, that there were a great many protesters who weren't blocking any entrances at the union, although they did largely unintentionally have this effect. But I can only wish them more power. I'm grateful that people are willing to publicly defend their views and challenge what they perceive to be evil without holding back. That's great. But I've also seen a whole lot of apology for those who were blocking entrances. There's this straw man being pestilentially spread around the university, that those who are angry with the people who were blocking entrances to the union are somehow challenging their right to protest. They seem to think that the right to voice opposition to a speaker is one and the same with the right to prevent that speaker from being heard at all. I see this more and it's more and more worrying every time, especially because this isn't any longer the activity of some negligible minority. To take an archetypal example from a Facebook page that allows Oxford students to anonymously post their grievances for other students to see, here's someone, whilst in no uncertain terms supporting the right to protest, complaining about people blocking entry to the union, which they see as unacceptable. And the response comes, the sense of entitlement in believing that you should have the right to go legitimise a fascist without opposition is staggering. Who's preventing opposition here? I spoke to a vast and varied number of people, and not one of them expressed an opinion that there should be no opposition to Bannon or no opposition to the union. It's a blatant misrepresentation to claim that people who have a problem with blocking movement in a public space and entry to an event have a problem with protest or opposition in general. And not knowing if this is done purposefully, I have to be either astounded at the inability to distinguish between the two, or disgusted that anybody would intentionally fabricate such a conflation. I'm appalled, as someone who prides myself on my willingness to hold fast to freedom of speech regardless of who's benefiting from it, that someone would think that I'm somehow against protesting or against opposition because I'm not in favour of preventing the movement of people. Don't think for 1 minute that by opposing the idea that a group of would-be authoritarians should be able to block the entrance to events that make them uncomfortable, and in the process, by the way, also block completely unrelated students just trying to get into their accommodation and their libraries and their bars having nothing to do with the event, which is absurd, that the right to protest is being impinged. It's not. Where does the original poster say that there should be no opposition? Does he not open his post with a throat clearing expressing support for the right to do exactly this? If you can't see the difference between protesting and setting up a human embargo, or think it's a difference without a distinction, then I really can't help you. If someone like, say, Anjem Choudhury, who I'm far more acquainted with than Steve Bannon, was speaking at the Oxford Union, as he's been invited to do previously in fact, I might well be found outside trying to let people know just how despicable a human being he is, but if I saw anybody, even from whatever group I found myself with, trying to block entrance to the event, I'd consider it my duty, since the whole reason I'm there in the first place is to condemn him for his affronts to individual freedom, to make it unequivocally clear that such a person is not on my side and does not have my support. That's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to protest a man's views and perhaps an institution's platforming of him, not to enforce an event's dissolution. There's a word for that kind of behaviour, and it's not liberalism. To be clear, protests are necessary and delightful and engaging and headline-making and incredibly useful. I encourage you to take part in them as much as you possibly can wherever you see injustice. But don't call yourself a liberal if you won't allow dissent from your condemnation. Don't expect me to be quite so enthusiastic about your decision to enforce your ideas through suppression. I won't stand for it, and one important reason why I won't stand for it is that now, because of this controversy, far more attention has been given to Steve Bannon's views, and specifically his talk at the Oxford Union, than ever should have been. The event was filmed and posted to YouTube. It's not like anyone stopped him from being heard. All they've done is make people who agree with Bannon feel legitimized in their discontent for the protesters and their views, and encourage people who would otherwise agree with them and be a valuable asset to their protests run a mile and reconsider their decision to be on the side of Bannon's opposition. These people are standing on their own tail, and it's going to hurt like hell when they notice. But aside from just blockading an event, which is fairly inherently reprehensible, there were also some confused and ridiculous things being chanted. One of my favourites was the chant, "Who protects Nazis? Police protect Nazis." This one was inescapable. The views expressed by the protesters were that by protecting Steve Bannon from the mob, the police were facilitating fascism and white supremacy. The police, of course, were protecting everyone. Everyone. Do you really think that the men and women who want nothing more than to just finish their shift and go home care in the slightest about your political views? They're there to prevent violence wherever it comes from. They're also there to uphold the law, of course, including freedom of speech. And that's everyone's speech. Yes, even a Nazi's, because what is the law if it's not indiscriminate? If a real Nazi were knocked out at a protest and went to a UK hospital, he would receive medical treatment. A doctor's job is to prolong health. Anyone's health. When a Nazi is hospitalised, how stupid would someone look to claim that the NHS is somehow facilitating the rise of fascism? It really doesn't take much thought to see right through this fatuity. Now, to avoid making this video too long, I won't discuss in any more detail what I think of the idea of police protecting the rights of Nazis, but I'll happily write a blog post or something if any of you want me to. Just let me know in the comments. But here's an interesting thought. I was quite offended by this chant and its implications. So to the protesters, what if I am offended by your chant? What if I said that suggesting that Oxford's police is fascistic waters down fascism and in turn helps to facilitate its actual rise more unnoticeably and so is incredibly dangerous speech? Whether I was right or wrong about this, what if I had a group of people surround you and not let you move or get near the police and not let your protest be heard? Remember, the biggest argument against the people who criticised the protesters was that they somehow didn't respect the right of Bannon's opposition to protest. So if I were to physically prevent people from hearing what you had to say, would you be okay with that because you respect my right to protest? Of course you wouldn't, and you'd be right to feel that way. It's one thing to say, I don't like your chants, so I'm going to chant back. It's another thing entirely to say, I don't like your chants, so no one's allowed to hear them. Likewise, it's one thing to say, I don't like Steve Bannon, so I'm going to protest. It's another thing entirely to say, I don't like Steve Bannon, so you're not allowed to hear him. Just who do you think you are? How patronizing and offensive to suggest that I'm not capable of recognizing contemptible speech when I hear it. I don't need you to tell me that Steve Bannon has bad ideas. I don't need you to tell me that I should oppose his platform or his message. And I certainly don't need you suggesting that listening to someone is somehow an endorsement of them. But if that is what you want to say, then go ahead and say it. Because the difference between you and me is that whilst I find your words incredibly insulting and offensive, I don't claim the warrant to block them from being heard. The only reason why someone would consider trying to block your speech, as far as I can see, is if they're so insecure about their own that they can't bear to have it publicly challenged. Have some courage in your convictions. The reason I'm okay with allowing you to say contemptible things about the police force that's protecting all of us is that I can quite easily hold my opposition to you without having to prevent people from hearing your side of the argument. Your argument fails at the moment of its presentation, and I'm willing to let fellow liberals recognise this for themselves. I might be quite scared by what you have to say, but I'm not scared of you saying it. I want you to say it. It's demonstrably the most effective way to make it crumble. To be clear, this has nothing to do with whether or not the union should have given a platform to Bannon. I fundamentally support free speech, of course, but that doesn't mean that a private institution can't choose to deplatform whomever it likes. That's their choice, that's their right. But they did decide to give him a platform. And look how when he walked into the chamber, there was some slow clapping along with some boos and hisses. Not the most welcoming of entrances. People weren't there to legitimize him, they were there to look him in the eye. When the union invited Little Mix to speak this term, that wasn't an endorsement of pop music, it was a recognition of its cultural significance. And say what you want about Steve Bannon, but you can't seriously argue that he isn't culturally significant. I respect the union's right to platform whomever they like, and I respect the right of its members to protest such decisions, as many of them did. But if a private institution decides to host a free human being to speak on any issue with any level of fervency, it's their prerogative, just as it's your prerogative to decide whether or not to attend, or whether to protest or counter-protest. The moment any of these rights is taken away, that is, the rights of Bannon, the union, the protesters, the counter-protesters, whoever, we're in seriously dicey territory, and it would do us all well to give it some serious thought. You may be absolutely right. Maybe the speaker who's at the union tonight, whomever it may be, is a fascist, or a communist, or a nationalist, or a fundamentalist, or a laissez-faire liberal, or a moderate conservative. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that if you think any of these things, more power to you. Congratulations for having an opinion. Show up and demonstrate your absolute and fundamental opposition to every word that comes out of that speaker's mouth if you like. But don't expect to be applauded by those who don't agree with your diagnosis. And for God's sake, don't antagonize those who completely agree with you, but just want to express their disapproval from inside the chamber and in front of the speaker instead of from the street. This speaker may be, say, a fascist, but don't you dare imply that I don't have the agency to work that out for myself. You're not the arbiter of acceptable speech. Neither am I, neither is the Oxford Union, and neither is the government or the police. And thank goodness this is the case. Please, I implore you, shout as loudly as you can for those things that you choose to believe in. Shout them directly at a speaker as he enters an event, and fill up a street with people to demonstrate solidarity. But just don't claim to be a liberal if you don't also uphold a person's right to walk past your protest and into the chamber and listen to what they have to say. Oxfest, the Facebook page where all of these arguments are kicking off, is anonymous, leading to fairly empty debate and ease of retreat. So here's a face to an opinion, and I will happily discuss it with anyone who isn't scared to death by my disagreement with them. Any students of Oxford who were at the protest, anyone who saw about it online, if you think I'm wrong on this, as if I haven't made this obvious enough already, I encourage and anticipate you to challenge me. But if you prefer, you can just ignore me and not listen to me. You don't have to. And isn't that liberty just so precious? I've been Alex O'Connor. You can follow me on social media here. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.